Hello, and welcome to the God and Entertainment Podcast with your hosts, Brian Godawa and Chris Moore. Here's Brian.
Hi, welcome to our podcast. This is episode 2, Pandemic Movies, the sequel, The Zombie Apocalypse. I'm one of your co-hosts, Brian Godawa, and I'm a Hollywood screenwriter and a novelist. My co-host is...
Hi, I'm Chris, and I am an editor and a writer. And I've also, like Brian, been working in Hollywood for over 2 decades.
We have to do our website, so Godawa.com. We have to do our shameless act of self-promotion.
And what, Brian, is on your site? What would I find if I navigated there?
And so on Godawa.com, basically, I try to make it a very interesting website, so it keeps you abreast of all the projects I'm working on, whether movies or novels. And I've got lots of great free material, and a lot of pictures, a lot of just explanations and stuff, really cool stuff. That it's not your typical boring website for a writer. I'll tell you that. So you can find out about all kinds of stuff that's free before you're even interested in buying into the novels. And my focus right now in my novels is I'm retelling biblical stories with the supernatural viewpoint in them. So this is not your typical Sunday school sort of retelling of Bible stories. And I can't really talk about the movie projects I'm working on right now because they're sort of super secret. So, oh well.
But you blog quite often on your site too, right?
Yeah, I do, because I'm on a lot of podcasts and stuff, and I do blog a little bit, not a lot, but I always put my latest interviews on the blog as well. So where I'm talking about my novels and going into detail and stuff like that. So how about you?
So for my site, it is cmobmo.com, which is I was born and raised in Jersey. I put a little edge on it. CMO is sort of a nickname. My nickname, it came up some years ago. Maybe someday I'll get into that story of where it came from. But CMO and BMO is in like you might expect. Be more, see more, be more. Encourage everybody to that's what we're hoping through this podcast, to inspire others to, whether you're an artist struggling, you're starting out as an artist, or you're a seasoned pro, just trust in the Lord, let go of your fears, learn and discern, and just kick butt and hopefully do great work. So my site, if you go to cmobmo.com, you'll see an audio drama, 2 audio dramas, one that I produced, one that I wrote and directed. Right now I'm putting up a short story that's part of a collection I'm working on with a friend named Michael, and we're putting out a book of short stories with biblical analysis of each. And these short stories there's Twilight Zone stuff in there, there's just modern social issues. I've got a story called Blackface in there about a kid in Jersey in 1991 who goes out on Halloween in blackface. He's a white kid, and he convinces his 2 African-American friends to go. So I'm working on a ton of different stories and working on a couple books. So there's excerpts of stuff there. And yeah.
Okay, so we're in the middle of a 3-part series. We're in part 2, 3-part series called Viruses in the Zombie Apocalypse. And, we wanted to do movies about pandemics and their threat on human extinction and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, because we're starting the podcast out in the middle of a pandemic, we thought that might be nice. But there are genres of movies. These are genres that we love anyway. So we love to talk about this kind of stuff. Now, the first episode we talked about was about viruses and such. And I don't know if it was the first show, and I don't know that we hit everything we wanted to talk about, but. I think we've got a lot to talk about with this next episode because both Chris and I love it. And but before we jump into zombie movies, we wanted to just talk a little bit about horror, because we know that particularly the religious audience, Christians or Jews or what have you, might oftentimes have a hard time with horror, and I understand why. But horror is a genre that is actually like any other genre. It can be used for good or bad. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people, in the religious communities tend to sort of see the bad versions of everything like horror and just sort of throw it all out, right? So it's, horror is just the worship of fear or worship of evil. They think that it's actually that kind of a thing, as if you watch horror because you like evil, but that's really not the case. And as Christians, we both have come to appreciate the horror genre. And for myself, I can say that one of the reasons why, in fact, if you, hopefully when we have this posted, we'll put a link to, I have a free article that I wrote called An Apologetic of Horror. And what I did there was I described how horror is a much maligned genre, but actually it's very biblical. And as a Christian, I always, I like to, I live my life based on the moral values that I see in the Bible. And when I did a study in the Bible, I found that God actually loves the horror genre because he uses so much of it. For example, one of my favorite books of all time is the book of Revelation, and everybody knows that's a symbolic book full of symbols. There's all different interpretations, but at the end of the day, you've got multiple seven-headed dragons, you've got monsters running around eating people. These are all symbols of things, and they're all monsters and horror. And of course, my second favorite is Book of Daniel, which also has the beasts coming out of the sea and out of the land, and they're hybrid monsters like you see in Frankenstein or Godzilla. And so, and I could go on and on where God tends to use horror in the prophets a lot, because in the prophets, they are trying to communicate the spiritual wickedness of particularly Israel and how it needs to repent and turn back to Yahweh, right? And so that genre, God uses images like, I think it's Malachi. Sorry, I don't have the verse on my fingers, but there's a verse where he talks about how he literally. I used this verse. I should have been more prepared. I think it's Malachi 3. Chris, why don't you look that up while I'm talking?
Yeah, you talk a lot.
I think it's Malachi 3, and God is talking about how the leaders of Israel have been apostate and led his people astray, and he literally uses the zombie metaphor. He says, you are eating the flesh of my people, you are cooking it and eating it and cutting them up. I kid you not. And of course, it's clearly a metaphor, but that's the point. He's using horror to communicate spiritual seriousness. So that's So in a very real sense, from my perspective, we live in a postmodern society that tends to believe that morality is relative, right? And so therefore you can't judge other people, for their morality. Unless, of course, you're the morality that I don't like, then I can judge it, But in general, they don't want you judging them for their morality. But the problem is that in the horror genre really brings home the power of absolute good and evil. And when you watch a horror movie and you read a horror novel, this is real evil, and this monster or evil murderer, whatever it is, deserves to die. We must fight and destroy real evil. It's not one man's freedom fighter is not another man's terrorist. That is the case in their perspective, but in reality, no, there are really evil people who deserve, whatever monsters. We're going to talk more about the metaphors as well. But my point is horror has for me been a very moral medium, moral genre, and that's why I've actually written several horror films and had one made, and so I think it's one of the strongest ways of really punching home a spiritual message to people, not the least of which is in horror films you can be more explicitly supernatural and even explicitly Christian. Like you for the life of you can't get a movie made of a romantic comedy where it's about Christians, unless you're going to make it in the Christian movie world, but in terms of Hollywood, you can't. But you can make Hollywood movies about demonic possession or horror movies, and you can bring in a strong and explicit Christian message, and it often is the case. That often happens. We'll talk about that for sure eventually. But so that's from my little personal journey. That's why I wrote the apologetic for horror, because I knew many Christians would be like, what? How can you say that? But I give all these biblical references and prove it from the Bible, and so there are. And I'll just wrap this up, and I'll give you your time too, Chris. And but there's in the article I write, I think 3 basic ways that horror is a helpful genre. One is that it can be used to reveal man's original sin. This is this notion that, people tend to think, oh, we're all good, we're all basically good, and it's the system that's bad or evil. But it shows that individual human hearts are evil. Another way that horror is valuable is it's used as social commentary. We're going to talk about that when we talk about zombies. Social commentary, it's a metaphor for social commentary. But also it's a way for showing man's hubris, human hubris. Humanity thinks we're God, or we want to be like God, or we want to be control of everything, or what have you. And it often, like think Jurassic Park here, it comes back and it bites you because you are going beyond what you should be able to as a human being. So those are some ways that I think horror as a genre is really powerful, and that's what drives me personally. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I think you covered it. I don't have to add too much. We started talking about Frankenstein and wanting to be gods, and that for me is a big draw to this genre, because the big thing is whenever, like Tower of Babel, whenever we as humans start to step into a place, whether it's we're going to talk about a movie tonight about cure for cancer backfires, cure for Alzheimer's backfires. Oh, we talked in the last episode about Outbreak. We have this super powerful virus that we can use as a weapon of mass destruction, and that backfires. It's these trying to take control over the world in a large scale way, forcing human will over trying to supersede the Lord's. It backfires, and that's one of the things that I love. And I do want to get into one thing really quickly. The verse was Micah that you were quoting. It's Micah 3:1-4. So you had it. It was Micah.
Thanks
so if anybody
for that.
wants to know that.
How'd you find that? Since I was wrong with Malachi.
Because I typed in the actual flesh and eating flesh, and I put in the wrong verse, but it got me to the right one.
Great.
So
Yeah,
thank
that's
goodness.
good.
Thank goodness for the internet.
Yeah,
for Google, although it's not the greatest, it does come through sometimes.
Yeah, and if I'm the apologist of horror, I should have that at my fingertips. But I always mix up Micah and Malachi, so it's Micah 3. Great. Okay, well let's
you were
keep
really
moving.
close.
I wanted to ask you though. So have you ever? Do you have any projects or stories that you've told where you've used the horror genre? Not that. Don't get into too much detail, but just has that been something you've done?
Good question. I am working on a story. It's going to be a while before it comes out, but I'm working on a story that. It's very hard to do, and I guess I know that you know this. When you're telling a modern setting story and you're doing it from a Christian perspective, it's hard not to go to the great solution very quickly in a story. All I have to do is believe and call out Christ. I have to believe it, but I have to call out and I can cast a demon out. But we know that the apostles tried to do that. The disciples tried to do that, and it didn't work. A lot of in the early days of this, when Christ was walking and teaching, people who followed tried to do it and it didn't work. It exploded because they didn't really believe. And that's the kind of thing, if you're going to tell that kind of story and go into horror and deal with real faith, that's why The Exorcist, with a lot of hard stuff that's in that movie that I don't necessarily recommend all Christians seeing, is so great, is dealing with a priest who isn't sure that where his faith is, what he believes. And or how deep his faith is, and that causes issues. So what's really awesome is dealing with that struggle. So I have a story that I'm working on, and I have a part of the story that I really love is a demon does turn crosses upside down, and this character's sharp enough to know, calling out to the demon, that upside down cross doesn't mean what you think it does. Hollywood doesn't understand what that cross means, and that's how he gets a foothold in on this demon. So.
Cool. One other thing I want to throw out here too was, horror. One of the reasons why it's needed is because one of my biggest messages when I teach storytelling is that dealing with we could, by the way, we'll probably have a whole episode on sex and violence and should the Christian watch Game of Thrones, But one of the things that I think is so important is that for a story to ring true, for a story to really hit home with an audience, is if you, or I put it this way, the power of your redemption that you are offering in your story because the story is ultimately about redemption. The power of your redemption that you're offering is only as powerful as the depravity or the sin that you are, the accuracy of the sin that you're depicting from which they're being redeemed. So if you know, one of my complaints with a lot of these Christian movie stuff is their villains are like, TV villains from the 70s. It's like they talk a lot, but it's not believable. It's just, you don't feel a sense of danger, that kind of a thing. And this is where it becomes dangerous in terms of, how far do you go, how much evil do you show, and how wicked and all that kind of stuff. And of course, there's a lot to debate. We have a lot to talk about, not between you and me, but I'm just saying with people, we have to wrestle with that. But in essence, you have to accurately show evil, or your good has no power. And the more wicked you can stomach in recognizing, then the more glorious is that redemption. Does this justify all kinds of exploitation and bloody violence and of all kinds? No, it doesn't. But as a principle, you start there, and then you move on.
Exactly.
For example,
Agreed.
in the Bible, Bible doesn't always show all the details. Sometimes it gives what's called a summary narrative, where it just says, David cut off his head and blah, 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 blah. But there are passages where it's very detailed, like when Eglon, Ehud kills King Eglon, it describes the sword going into the belly and his bowels fall out, So there are some explicit passages. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what would justify that? And that's where we have to talk about the specifics. So that was another element of horror. And of course, zombie movies are very explicit. So anything else you want to add about horror before we jump into zombies?
When we start rolling, we're going to get to some discussion of some of the writers tonight of these big zombie films we're talking about. And we're going to talk about George Romero. And there's something that he said in an interview before he died recently about, there's something that triggered what he said about making that film that reminded me as a writer, where you have to be aware that the story that you're telling has a life of its own, and you have to listen to it, and you have to decide whether what you want to do and what the story is telling you, and that includes violence or not, you have to listen to it. But I'll wait to comment until we get there.
Okay,
so,
sounds good.
Yeah, I think it's good. I want to, unless there's something else you want to say, I do want to go through a quick list of, very quickly, for like 30 seconds, a list that was published in the past couple of years about some of the big key issues of why we love zombie films. And I'd love to just start out really quickly.
Sure. First of all, let me just say, I'll let you lead on that one because it was good and such. But I just wanted to mention, what's the point of zombie stories, and some of what I think is the purpose of zombie stories is they're often used as a metaphor. I've already mentioned this, for social commentary, and most of the ones we're going to talk about do anyway, so we'll talk about that. But I think that there are deep questions that are being asked in the genre, and from my mind, they circle around a couple of major issues, which is what makes us human. And this is not just a philosophical question. This is actually an emotional it's a very psychological question as well. What makes us human? And it's a moral question. How shall we behave? And also, what makes civilization? Of course, the whole point of the zombie is the living dead. They are without souls, or whatever you want to call it. They're not really humans. They're reanimated corpses. They're just out to eat you or whatever. So they represent the loss of humanity in and of themselves. But also, then that ends up becoming a question of the survivors and all that. So that's those are a couple of really big questions. And then the last third question that I see it as is, I can't remember, so maybe it'll come out as
when
we're
it does
talking.
come back. What I want to add to that, my own personal draw to this genre, without looking at what experts say, just from a gut, there are two big things that stand out. One is, the first one leads into the second, and it is this: me but not me. Now, there's in academia, this term "me but not me" is sometimes used to say I'm a certain race, like I'm white and privileged, and I see somebody, a person of color, and they're me because they're human, but they're not me. That is not what I'm talking about. And I've looked up this philosophy and have not been able to find what I'm talking about in the exact specific term. But it's this: it's you there is a fear, I believe, that we have deep down in our psyche that we become something, a monster that we don't want to become, and that we can't necessarily stop ourselves, but we are conscious of it and we're aware that what we're doing is wrong or dark. And that is the thing of nightmares. And the reason I say it is because one of my first nightmares that I remember as a kid, and it goes back decades, over 4 decades ago, was being some sort of a zombie cannibal. And I this is when I'm 5-6 years old, and I can guarantee you in the 70s I was not watching zombie movies, nor was I allowed to watch them. Where I think that these dreams came from as being a 5-year-old watching Land of the Lost in the 70s, and there were some episodes in there where Marsha, Will, and Holly, the brother, sister, and the father, who were trapped in this dinosaur land with mystery and magic and slee stacks, that there were some episodes where some of the father, and I think even one point the brother or the sister, all of them were like mesmerized to become almost zombie-like. And that got into my brain and it gave me some nightmares. And one that I will never forget, I had it multiple times, was that I became a type of zombie cannibal where I knew there were people around me, and they were either people that I knew and some family members were becoming these animal-like versions of themselves. And it's very tame. It's a rated G, really, version of a dream for a kid that a kid would have. But they were becoming cannibals, and I didn't want to become it, but I felt them pulling me because I was, whatever was happening, because I was around them, I was part of the family, their group. There was pressure. And at one point I had a dream where I did become one. And that was one of the most scary, not frightening in the way like waking up with night terrors, scary on a profound level, because as I said, I can still remember how I felt now, and this is all these years later, that I became a monster and I was aware of it and I submitted and I became something. And I think for me, that has been something of interest with zombie movies, which I didn't come to watch until I was later in my teen years. But I think there's something about that. I would bet that I'm not the only person. Maybe he didn't have that dream, but that there's some kind of a fear. I think there's something really deep about that. And I'll parlay from that to another reason why I think we're interested in it is there is study and research for those who are therapists and doctors who work in particular for the VA and work with vets with PTSD because they were forced to kill when they didn't want to. They had to become killers, and they were put in a situation because, and rightfully so, in many occasions, these guys had to actually protect people and themselves, and they've become something that they don't want to be, and they don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to process. And I think what's interesting is zombie movies put us in this weird vicarious situation where we're also fascinated with the fear of what happens if we become something we don't want to become. And some of the academic studies about zombie movies say we like the fear of that because we know it won't happen. We're comfortable. Basically, the gist is, we like the thought of an apocalypse. We like the thought of, we do like watching violence. But again, if we're safe, because a zombie movie is so crazy, it's so far removed from reality. It will never happen. So we get to indulge and engage in these things. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, and also the studies say what you said, Brian, about it's about our humanity, and you either come out worse because your true nature showed that you're a terrible person, or you come out better. You come out realizing that you were willing to sacrifice. You may live or you may not, but you learn to become a human being that's what God wants us to be, sacrificial and willing to put our lives on the line for others. So that's it. And just this whole apocalyptic thing.
Before you go on, I just want to throw it. This has been one of the reasons why, for me, zombie movies are one of my favorite genres, is because most of them, one of the dominant themes is sacrifice. And I've said this in the last show as well, but it's sacrifice versus survival. And we're gonna, when we talk about these, and specifically like The Walking Dead, that's literally what it's all about. And the idea is that when you're in this kind of situation of the living dead, where these are soulless monsters that are trying to kill you and they won't stop, and there's no reason, you're on the run, and of course they're numbers, right? So it's all about being overwhelmed, and what do you do, and how do you survive? And you have to survive, but how do you survive? It's like, do you care about the community or only your individual? So these values of sacrifice and survival, I would argue it's a contrast of Darwinism, basically, versus Christianity in the end, because so it's that moral structure, and And I've said this before, and I feel like, my human sinful nature is still with me, and I have to fight it, even though I have the Holy Spirit and all this. But the truth is that I'm a selfish person. And so I want to watch stories that inculcate and reinforce the kind of sacrifice. And it's extreme, like you said, it's the extreme. It's like a lot of times it's people giving their lives, if not risking their lives to save others, to be eaten, in order to save others. Well, that in and of itself is the ultimate sacrifice, right? To give your life for another. And to me, I want that to be soaked into my soul, so that if I ever get into situations where I'm needed to give of others or protect myself, that I will have saturated myself with those values. And that's why I like it. It's because it inculcates those values.
Yeah, and I would add that,
for survival.
Sorry, that dream that I had when I was a kid, I actually believe that was part of God working on me, saying, I'm going to give you some knowledge here now when you're a kid about following people into dark places, because he may have known I needed it. I actually, if my brain was going those places and worried about it, then he knows that I needed to be exposed to it. And that's exactly it. Being prepared. And that's one of the things also that a lot of experts say, that we love zombie movies because it helps us feel like we would be the good people. And it helps us to look at how will we be prepared. And that's something really interesting is, I'm watching these films to learn exactly like you just said, Brian, that I'm going to be one of these good people. And let me think about what I would really do. And I would love sometime to just do a survey of people who love this genre, and across all, I don't care what people's worldview is, and say, where do you feel that you would fall? I'm really curious if a majority of people think that they would be the heroic, or at least, and I think because we live in a time where subjective reality rules the day, we might get more people who would actually admit, no, I think I'd be a jerk. I think I'd throw people out the window and I would feed people to the zombies. I wonder if the number of people who'd be willing to admit that they would do that has significantly risen in modern times, in 21st century times.
But I think what you're saying too is very true, in the sense that I've heard about this in other examples of life where like things like self-defense and stuff. If you study a little bit about self-defense, as well as any kind of scenario in life where something, something threatening can happen. It could be real threat, it could be life threat, it doesn't have to be. But the point is that they've done studies where it's like, if you do not think through what you will do in a situation, then chances are you won't do anything. Whether it's someone who's attacking you on the street, if someone, if you ever think about, like, what would I do if someone just comes at me, and most normal people are just it's so shockingly unbelievable that they don't believe it, and so they don't do anything. But the value of this movies, despite the fact that it's very violent, in fact, maybe because it's very violent, it actually does force you to think more about, what would I do in extreme situations where violence is coming at me and I have to do something violent in order to survive or to protect someone else. And just the act of thinking through that and being exposed, again, the power of stories is it reinforces values, and the more you're reinforcing it, the more you've thought it through, so that if it happens, the more you're likely to behave correctly. What else do the experts have on that list?
Yes, that you know what, we covered it. Between what we talked about, I think we covered enough of it. One of the last things on the list is helping to relieve stress. Like, you go, and that's horror in general too. You come through this experience that's horrific, but yet you're still safe, even though you want to be scared. It's like you're on a roller coaster, but you're not jumping off a cliff. You're on a roller coaster that's going to park, and you're going to get off. So yeah, and it's that release, the catharsis.
One thing I want to say too, right up front, is that and I'm sure you would agree with me, that horror, and particularly zombie movies, are not for everyone. And so we're sitting here defending, and look, there are some people like my wife who could never watch anything like that, because the violence it just touches them more personally in a way that's just negative. And it's true that it can be, and certain personality types can't handle it, but that doesn't mean other people can't. And that's not to justify all excesses. But what I'm saying, and what we're going to to talk about is the context is what matters the most. I mean, if you can make an argument for a story where, I would argue that there is a way to exploit rather than expose evil. So if you're exploiting sin, maybe like, for instance, a movie that might glory in evil, and there are a lot of movies that do that, where
The Witch is very interesting, but at the end it's hopeless. God is deaf, isn't even maybe real, but the devil's real.
Yeah,
and
that's that was a very interesting movie.
But
it was very disturbing in that sense.
They have these endings, but Hereditary I hated at the time. We'll talk another time.
But
I liked it.
But Midsommar,
I liked it upon
Midsommar was good.
It was, and I liked it for a whole lot of reasons. Although, of course, super violent. We'll talk about those another time.
So the thing about violence is that. Again, like I said, if you don't take the purpose of some extremes is that you need to be brought to that edge in order to understand. It's sort of like you need to be faced with death for you to really take serious what life is. And by the way, that's another reason why I love zombie movies, because it really does. You are faced with your impending doom and death, and it's not about like, oh, I just glory in fear. No, what it is watching these stories of characters who are just faced with their death makes you think about, wow, what am I doing with my life? If I was facing death, would I be ready to face death? And I think it's valuable to think about these things, but those are some issues, the violence and such, that it's not for everyone. And I would argue too that sometimes I was not always a zombie fan. In fact, though I recognize what George Romero was doing in those years, I didn't like them. They were just gory, and there was social commentary going on very loudly. But I just thought that it was just so excessively gory.
Me too. I was not really a big fan, and I didn't see Night of the Living Dead until I was in my 30s probably. And I looked at it, I was like, whoa, wow, this is a much better movie, and I've imagined this is better than any of those Night of the Living Dead movies. I didn't realize.
But again, that can be subjective, and that's it's not black and white. So you have to really wrestle through those things, and that's fair. One of the other things that I think that zombie movies is good for is we'll just be talking about the genre all before we get to the pictures. That's okay.
After you say this comment, I have a couple things to say. So say this comment, and then I'm going to jump in.
We're going to have a couple episodes on this, folks. So we want to set you up. So another element of the zombie genre is this notion of, well, first of all, as most horror films, as most movies reflect the time in which they are, and so zombie movies often and horror movies reflect also the fears of the era. And so you've got one of those examples. For example, the older zombie movies, they tend to be zombies because of radiation, nuclear war, that kind of stuff. And then as time goes on, it becomes biological warfare and such. And so, but one of those elements is the slow versus the fast zombie. And of course, the origin of the zombies. If you look back, it was like some voodoo South American thing where it was about. In fact, I think one of the first movies was called White Zombie with Bela Lugosi.
1932. Yep.
Yeah, and I saw that, and it was kind of interesting. But the idea was based on this voodoo or hoodoo belief. I can't remember which one, but that that they could. People who were dead and the voodoo doctor could actually, use the magic and bring them back to life. But unfortunately, they were living dead, meaning, they didn't have their souls and they were just like, oh, that kind of thing. And of course, it was more individualistic when it was conceived way long ago. But as time goes on and we started having, nuclear fallout or fears of nuclear wars and all that stuff, and mass destruction, with that comes mass humanity. And so you started to have these mass amounts of zombies, arising.
What's interesting is about voodoo, there's an acknowledgement in the voodoo films, like, again, that White Zombie is a voodoo. The guy who, Bela Lugosi, is like a voodoo. His name is Murder. And there's a sense of, okay, if we're going to deal with zombie stuff, we're going to deal with there's an evil here about a spiritual evil, and that is diluted. And now when we talk about zombie movies, even in Night of the Living Dead,
science.
It's science, or we've just gone away from it. And it's very interesting for us to examine that and be aware that, that hasn't gone. It's started showing itself up in how do we behave. It went from, oh my goodness, in that Bela Lugosi movie, it's about a lover and a jealous lover who want the same woman, and the jealous lover gets her turned to a zombie so that she'll be with him, and then he's like, oh my goodness, she's not the person that she was. What was I thinking? We got to get her back. And they have to kill the sorcerer guy, the voodoo guy, to get her free. But what we have now, instead of dealing with, the actual person, we have, what are the people around the zombies? What are we dealing with their moral character? And it's a way to deal with spirituality in the world, but the world isn't acknowledging that it's actually about God. It's very interesting that, again, I said this first episode, that no matter how much you say God doesn't exist and you write stories and you tell these stories, it's overwhelmingly apparent how God is real, and it comes out in these stories. You can't, it's like trying to stop water with your hands when a stream is coming at you. You may think somehow you're blocking some of the flow, and you may not see what's hitting your face if you do this, but it's going around. There's nothing you can do. So
yeah. Well, so the slowness makes sense logically because they were dead and they don't have their soul or whatever, however you interpret that. And so, and they're the living dead. They're not like they're not resurrected technically, I think. They're just, the dead body has become reanimated, but not with the original person's soul. And part of the point is that's why they're not considered human anymore, which justifies, the slaughtering them, because they're just going to eat you and kill you, and there's no humanity to them. And that's fine, because that's an acceptable moral premise, actually.
Yes.
But the power of it was this overwhelming of all these slow guys, blah, blah, blah. But then as time goes on, in these more modern zombies, of course, they're not.
Definitely,
because as they become more
70s.
Biological, it becomes more like a disease that turns your body into a frenzy, and so you've got these fast zombies running after you, which those are my favorite, because those are the truly terrifying pictures of the worst of what we can become, and so the more modern has the speed, and of course, we've got, and then that even builds on itself, so that like the latest movies, World War Z and Train to Busan, these zombies are like just pile up on each other. They're so fast, So it's interesting to see the evolving of the way they're depicted and the way they operate in the world and such. But that's
like you said,
one of the elements.
We start to look at, what is the soul? What's going on with the humanity of the zombies themselves? And we're going to talk about Richard Matheson, I Am Legend, and the three versions and how they progress based on time.
First of all, let's hit the classic. We'll start with the Night of the Living Dead.
Quickly, I want to add one more thing.
Oh, go ahead.
One other thing I think that, and during a pandemic and even before this, why I think we really like zombie films, it's a secondary reason, but a reset of the world is very appealing. Let's get rid of everything, or all these stresses, my terrible job, all the hard work I have to do, all these stresses of commercialism and capitalism, or not. You could be anywhere in the world under oppression, and it's just like, let's reset it now. The world is wide open, and that can be bad, but it can be good. And
actually, I would say that socialism creates zombies and capitalism frees us. But
frees us. I don't.
Okay, so why don't you talk about Night of the Living Dead and introduce us to that?
Yeah, Night of the Living Dead, 1968 classic. John A. Russo and George Romero wrote it, but George Romero is the director, and it's a film. It's the most straightforward zombie film. It's a template film for how everything that came after that time in 1968 in the zombie genre. It literally deals with dead who are risen, who are not, as we've been talking about, are not the people that they were. And it deals with basically a strong focus on how do we behave as human beings under the duress. It brings out the best and the worst in us. And it has a little bit, because it's in 68, Cold War era, radiation makes its way in, which is the living with the Cold War, the fears of nuclear war. There's a little bit of that, but really it's just about man and women versus zombies, and what happens when we're in close quarters. How do we behave when our life is on the line? And that's the essence of the setup for that.
Raw,
this film.
Simple, straightforward. Absolutely. It was kind of interesting too, because what's interesting is to see the evolution. What we're gonna, basically, there 1968, and you've got the lead of the movie is a black guy, which is kind of shocking. I mean, it's not like, because it's an independent film, and it's not like he's Sidney Poitier or anything, right? But it's in that sense, it's quite a the independent world, is able to do that kind of thing more readily, But you told me about the story about that. I thought that was like, ooh, look at that little social commentary. But the truth is what?
The truth is, and I'll say, Jordan Peele has been quoted as talking about Get Out and the other projects he's been working on since, horror, and I would guess some of the Twilight Zone stuff that he's doing, the reboot. He's like, this movie is incredibly profound and had an impact on him because the lead character, Ben, and the actor's name is Dwayne. What's his name? His name's Dwayne Jones. That he's the African-American lead who's the guy who is the most sane. He's a strong guy. He's a leader. Turns out, absolutely, George Romero and the crew and the team that put the film together did not cast him because he was an African-American man. They did not write it for that. He was the best actor, and they said, okay, you got the job. And did not write any differences or changes in the script because he was an African-American guy.
Wait, you're telling me that they didn't hire him because of his race, but because of the quality of his acting?
Yes, but we got to be
They're
careful
not identity
with that.
Politics, Chris.
We have to be careful about
Gotcha.
that one. We have to be careful about that one because there's so many great African-American actors who couldn't work for years. As a matter of fact, people of color, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but my wife is Chinese, so we have lots of discussions about cultural differences and white privilege, by the way, and that's going to come out in this podcast. But one thing, there was a reunion.
And I will correct it when it comes up.
You can correct, and I'll recorrect, and we'll correct and recorrect. There's this guy named Josh Gad, and he has this Reunited show that's on now, which is awesome. And his first episode was Goonies, and they went through the whole thing. It was fun, and that the Asian kid actor in that, who played a character called Data in it, I believe his name is Data, he mentions at the end of this whole thing, he's in his early 40s now, and everybody always wondered, whatever happened to you? Why'd you stop working? And he said, I stopped working because I'm an Asian actor and nobody hired me. But now that things are changing, I can work. I'm looking for work. So anyway, when we talk about hiring people for their color, there are so many people who are incredibly talented that would never get hired if things hadn't kind of taken a turn the way they are now. So this is complicated, and we're going to talk about this in another episode.
But one of the things that I found interesting was, I was looking for, first of all, George Romero, he's being edgy in many ways, and he's an independent filmmaker. And he makes the black guy the lead. And at the end of the movie, the whole thing is, this guy, gets to the end and he survives. And then the sheriff's men have been hunting the zombies. And it's, he wakes up in the morning, clear day, he's looking out the window, and the sheriff's men and such, they see the house and they're looking for zombies because they're finishing them off, right? And the black guy is like looking out the window, and of course they think he's a zombie and they shoot him, right? But what's interesting to me was he completely avoided the political angle of it because they couldn't see him. In other words, it's not like he came out in the light. Nowadays it would be like, oh yeah, see, the black man is going to be killed because all white men are after the black men. And the truth is that no, he was in the shadow behind the window, so they just saw the shape of him. They saw a shape and they thought it was a zombie. So it's interesting that he went out of his way not to be political, which tells me, I don't know what it tells me, but it was kind of interesting that Romero was more interested in telling entertainment than just pushing a political agenda.
Yeah, and
I have
things
no,
were
I have
super
no problem.
heated.
I have no problem with, and we'll talk about that. Like all these examples, there are political angles and aspects to them. But what I really detest is when they're agenda driven and they're, like Jordan Peele, where it's just racism, parading as anti-racism. That's the kind of stuff that I can't stand.
Right.
But
we both have a tough time of that. And the choice that George Romero made to do exactly that, to make it clear that the two of them did not see each other, was very clear, because you got to remember, this is the height of civil rights. He could have easily made a statement about that, and he didn't want to, which I have something to say about that in a second. But what I will say is, it's very interesting, though. You have this two people who are pointing guns at each other, they can't see each other, and one of the guys kills the other. There's actually a statement about humanity there that is not about color. It's about fear, and it's about, we could even probe and try, as we're talking about this, think about what that means. But he's making a very strong statement in the end with the shooting and the tragedy of it. And then we don't see in the end, oh my gosh, he wasn't a zombie because he probably fell over when the character's named Ben fell over. He probably lost the gun and they're like, he's a zombie. They wouldn't know.
They would never know.
So they have no idea. But it was definitely the sense of, I think he's making a statement too about humanity. We shoot first and ask questions later. And I think that, and I'll say something really quickly, story about that film. A lot of those people who were on the hunt are real hunters, and the guy who's playing the sheriff in one of the reviews or one of the interviews I saw with George Romero, he's actually like a hunter. He's not a sheriff in real life. These guys kind of knew what they were really good at hunting with weapons because a lot of these guys were hunters. So there's this thing at the end of hunters versus somebody who's a survivor, and it's shoot first. And I think we have that humanity in us. He's criticizing us because he goes in on all these close-ups of the credits of all the dead people, including the bad people, the dad who's a bad guy in the house who's trapped, who winds up getting eaten by his daughter, and all the other innocent people. And it's like, it's really saying there's humanity here and this is tragedy, but he's not. They're not.
I don't know if I agree with that fully. I can see him sort of bringing an element of the caution of, we need to be not quick to the trigger maybe, but the whole point is the entire movie was just, they're surrounded by zombies and they're having to kill zombies because the zombies are killing people. So what I see at the ending is more of a tragedy, not like, because the truth is you gotta shoot him, you gotta kill him, you gotta shoot him in the head. And so by the time that happens, I see it more as a tragedy myself.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But
I think he's doing more
think
it's the tragedy than it is about making any kind of
statement. Right, but other movies
Agreed.
Do deal with what you said, and I think 28 Days Later is one of them.
Yep.
Let's jump into the I Am Legend trio.
No, wait, I don't want to leave this yet.
I'm sorry.
I don't want to leave this yet.
Okay.
We got some good stuff to talk about here, and I'll take the lead on this.
Okay.
I do not want to leave this yet. So, couple other things. And this is us talking as writers and as story creators. We talked about Dwayne. This guy, Dwayne Jones, the actor, played the lead African-American guy. He's just the best guy, and they cast him. Well, what's interesting is George Romero said in this story and in interviews, he wanted everything very clinical. He wanted all the actors to not be super excited and super nervous and kind of living as if, okay, this is bad stuff, but let's keep our heads on. And what he found is the actors didn't want to do that to the level that he wanted. And I thought, there are two really interesting things about that. One, they're living in the Cold War era, and he's coming from a time period, all the films leading up to this, where it's all monster hysteria movies. People are like, oh my gosh, and the end of the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the last guy who survives comes out and jumps in front of cars going, oh my gosh, they're coming or whatever. That's where they're coming from. And this is like, he's like, no, we don't want to do that. We want this to be straightforward. And this gets to what we talked about in the prior episode about pandemics, when we were talking about flu. The people in South Korea living under the oppression of North Korea and avian flu and human trafficking, and they're dealing with it in a very honest way. And that's what I think Romero was doing here, is he was really trying to keep the actors toned down because he wanted them to reflect the reality of living under the Cold War. But as a storyteller, he had to give some. He had to let back some and say, okay, you guys need to put some emotion, and some of you are more comfortable. And he had to listen. And what I love about that is, what I absolutely love about that is you can't, when we were mentioning earlier as being writers, sometimes a story will tell you your characters can't do what you want. It's not just when you're directing, it's when you're writing on the page. I think my characters are going to do this, and guess what? They're telling me that they're not going to let me do what I want. And I think that if you are a story creator of any sort, in any phase of the pipeline, if you're not struggling with issues where your characters, or if you're a director and your actors aren't giving you input that's different from what you want to do, I think there's something not quite right about your art. I'm curious what you think about that, Brian. Do you find yourself, when you're writing, your characters rebelling against some things you want to do because they're saying, no, you can't do it as easily as you want? Does that happen for you?
A little bit. My viewpoint's a little different from the typical in that sense, in that there is some discovery. There is some surprises, absolutely. However, what I found, and it fits more my view of whatever my worldview actually is that as the creator, as the God of my world, since I'm creating it, when I create characters, I do planning. I create, whatever. So Joe Schmo is a sacrificial guy. Maybe he's a military guy, so he knows how to sacrifice, but he's cold. He doesn't have many emotions. I set up characters specifically and to contrast them. Then I'll have the other guy who's selfish and he's very emotional. He's an artist or whatever, right? So I think ahead. And by the way, I think I'm speaking for many writers, because I get a lot of this advice from more successful than I. But my point is that in a way, we are creating the Aristotle said that basically what was it? Character is destiny. That's it. Character is destiny. What he meant by that is, and particularly with storytelling, is that what your values and the kind of person you are can be a certain amount of predictability to it, right? So, I mean, obviously, if there's an honest person, an honest Joe guy, if he's going to be challenged to lie, you're more than likely he's not going to, rather than someone who's more selfish, that kind of a thing. So if you set up a certain kind of character with a certain kind of personality type, certain kind of values, then that is very predictable how they will act. In fact, that's how you're going to have conflict, because I've created characters that I know are going to conflict, and so they do in those scenarios. So in that sense, I'm very much like, the author is very much like the creator God, in that he predestines, he creates people, and there's a certain amount of sovereignty over what happens in history. However, I will admit though that there are some surprises that sometimes when the story goes and when it's what the surprises come from the clash of the different characters that when you start to make them clash, then the things come out. But I would argue that if you're being consistent with your character, how you created them, there's an ultimate predictability to it, right? Even if it's a surprise to you in the moment, if you trace it back, you might say, oh, well, no, it makes perfect sense. Because otherwise, how many times have you seen a movie or reading a story and some character does something completely out of character, yes, right? And you go, he wouldn't do that, Well, that's because they're just whatever, they're letting plot dominate, or they're letting chance dominate, or they want to be entertaining and shocking, right? And I get all that, and sometimes we do a little bit of that, and also, not all humans are not entirely consistent, so I have no problem with the fact that a person might act inconsistently and it would shock us, because I've been that way myself. So that's kind of my view about characters and predictability and stuff. So I have some overlap. There's some surprise, but it is more, I would argue, probably more determined by the author than by the way you set up the character. Anyway.
I agree.
Is that too much?
No, I think that's good, because and I think what's interesting, exactly, if you know who this character is, you know what they're going to do in circumstances, and there's some breathing room, but you hit it exactly, the element of clash, where it's interesting with characters, or sometimes in a plot when I'm working and I have a character clashes in a very emotional way or a very heavy duty way, I'm like, oh my gosh, what I thought this character was going to do, because I do know who they are, and with this character I knew who they are, when they get together in this moment in a pot boiler, or they're in some moment, something happens, it's super intense. Suddenly, the character, because I know this character well, says, I'm not going to do what you put in your outline and your treatment even. I'm not going to do it, because that's not me in this moment. And I go, oh yeah, you're right. I still know that the plot is going to move forward the way it does, but it doesn't go the way... And in a treatment, earlier on, I'm a guy who likes to do outlines and treatments, meaning I like to write most of my beats out really fast and go through. So this way, when I go back and I'm writing, I'm on a third pass the first time I'm writing. And it gives me 3 checkpoints to see if what I'm doing is seeming phony or real. But even then, on that first write where I'm actually doing stuff, I'll go back to the treatment, the beats, and I'll go, you know what? This isn't what this character's honestly telling me they want to do. They could do what I said, but this is more realistic. This is better.
But what does this have to do with zombies, dude?
It just has to do with Romero saying he had an idea how these people had to behave and what they had to do.
Gotcha.
And it didn't. And he even says he would get the actors rolling without a camera. And once they started getting to a place where he felt, okay, now you're going where I want, he would turn the camera on. Because part of it's budget, black and white, they had to do it low budget. But I think that's a good point to make about whether it's acting or whether you're writing, you're in a creative process, and sometimes things don't go, and maybe it doesn't happen as much for you, but for me, I find myself in this situation a bit.
Okay, here's an unpredictable something we didn't plan for, but we partially planned this outline. But as we go along, we're kind of nearing the end of this show, so we could talk about one thing. I think let's leave the trio of I Am Legend, Omega Man, and The Last Man on Earth. Let's leave that for the next episode. We can get heavy into that. So we'll pick one thing to talk about, either the series The Walking Dead because it's so huge, or the 28 Days franchise. What do you want?
Let's do 28 because Walking Dead. There's a lot of good stuff to talk about there too.
So we'll hit Walking
Dead
the creator.
So
let's jump into 20. So 28 days later and 28 weeks later, and we're going to focus probably more on 28 days later. But this is one of my favorite all-time favorite zombie movies. It almost, I don't know, it didn't along with Shaun of the Dead. I don't know, it just did something for me because it was so profound in its meaning, and I watched it again, for us to talk about it and stuff, and it still had the same emotional, powerful impact upon me, very primal. And here's the basic storyline: is that Cillian Murphy wakes up in a hospital bed because he had surgery, and he looks all around. Or he was sick or had surgery or something, right?
Yeah, he was.
I think he had brain surgery
or something, and
Yeah, so anyway, so he wakes up and no one's around, right? And he starts walking out the street. What happened? So 28 days he was in a coma, and he comes out, and what's going on? And all of a sudden some zombies run after him, and he's on the run, and he gets rescued and all that. But the power of the story is that he gets a couple of allies, and they end up hearing about on the radio about this location where some military have housed up, and you're safe here. We got food. Come. So they make their way to this, and when they get there, it's a small band of military guys who are holding down the fort, so to speak. So they're very protected in that sense. It's very good. And the zombies are out there, and they come at night and they shoot them and take care of them. So it's all good. But the problem is that these are all men. They're military guys. They're over macho or whatever, and Cillian Murphy has a young black woman and a young girl with him that he's been protecting, and they of course get their eyes on those women, and they want to use them for their own satisfaction because they've been without women for 28 days, right? That kind. It's basically the worst of male nature, and then and when that realization comes, because first of all, they're like rescued and wow, they're protected in this fortress, so to speak, and they got guns and the zombies aren't going to get them. And then all of a sudden you start to see who these guys are, and you're like, oh my God, they've walked into a worse trap, right? And then what happens is that it breaks down, and Cillian Murphy actually escapes. They're going to kill him. He escapes, and he comes back to save the women, and he launches in a zombie, and it's this big brawl at the end, guys being killed by zombies and killing each other, and while he's trying to rescue the women and give them out of it. And so it was such a I remember this story is so powerful because it really does address that worst of the worst of male nature, of what it could be, and the horror that I sense as a man. I'm watching this and go, oh my God, that's real. But here's the thing: the reason why I love the movie is it's not focused on male bashing, man bashing, whatever. It's not the feminist utopian story, because Cillian Murphy, in order to he saves the women, and he saves them by engaging in violence against the evil men of violence. So I call this righteous violence. So Cillian Murphy represents the righteous violence that fights against the evil violence to rescue the women. So it's very chivalrous, which is not very positive in today's world, or not very liked in today's world. But I thought that it really has these old values that I actually agree with and love, but it's honest. It does show and admit the worst that male can be, but it's the answer to quote the toxic masculinity, the answer to evil men, evil violent men, is righteous violent man. And that's justice, that's goodness, not whatever, pacifism or whatever, whatever you want to call it. Just this sort of like you're not going to get out negotiating and all this kind of stuff. So forgive me for jumping in and going, just sort of spilling my guts. But it's one of the most powerful zombie movies. But please now, jump in and add or what have you.
No, I love your analysis of righteous violence, righteous retribution. righteous indignation, which leads to being forced. That's very biblical. And I absolutely agree. I love that. And I hadn't thought about that contrast between righteous indignation, righteous violence, and unrighteous. And especially when you talk about malehood, I'm going to go save these women, which is what the deepest core, man saving a man, yes, brotherhood. But when it comes to a woman, there's this deep, should be innate sense of doing this kind of chivalrous justice, being, again, sacrificial, putting yourself on the line, and if it means dying, then I'm going to do it. And that is so great. And for a movie like this that has extreme violence, it's really interesting that you come out with this biblical view that you can. With this movie, for me, when I first saw it in the theater, some of the things that are part of the storytelling you've mentioned. This is a super fast zombie movie. This is like you get it in your instant. I had never seen a movie turn zombie this fast. That was what was shocking about this. They changed this up. Now maybe there's some B movie out there that was done in the 80s or 90s.
But you're right. You're right. It was like he did the fast zombie movie. Unusually, it stood out. It stood out. Mainstream movie, I guess.
Yes, but regardless, that was exciting, and that was like Night of the Living Dead. This movie started a new genre of movies like World War Z. And the I Am Legend reboot, I believe the zombies become super zombified really quickly. Although we don't see people turning in the movie, but I think in the past it's very fast. I mean, it's just, but a few things here that's interesting. It's 28 days later. There's a sense of a rebirth into a new world, which again, you start this movie out, and when you see Cillian Murphy, when he comes out and you see London and it's empty, that was shocking and incredible. And you're like, this is a reset of a major city again. Everything is open, good and evil. Anything can happen. But there's this sense of 28-day cycle into something evil instead, which is abhorrent. And that's why the zombies are so evil. There's something wrong about this, and it's super evil. And the bad guys, again, it shows human nature, good and bad. But a couple things, storytelling, since we are talking about a film, something very interesting about this movie is the way it was shot. It was shot on video. And that gave this movie a hyper-realistic feel that it was like, oh my gosh, this is real. Because visual effects at that time on handheld shots, on video, to be able to rotoscope and to be able to put in realistic shots that looked like a big budget film, but were done on video with handheld shots, the technology was not super great at that time. So the fact that they pulled that off made this movie, and a lot of audience members wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate that, but I did because I worked in editorial, and I was like, wow, they're doing this. And the other thing is, Danny Boyle and his cinematographer decided to super degrade. They shot on like a high resolution, I think standard def digital format, and in the EPKs, the making ofs, you can see glimpses in the making of on the DVD of what the footage actually looked like, and it's much better. They purposely crapped up the image to make it look terrible
because they want to look like it's a home video, so like it really happened. Really, the genius of it to me was, we'll talk about this if we talk about Rec and Quarantine, but found footage horror films, the premise is, the Blair Witch Project. We found this footage, and so you're watching the real footage that they shot. That genre, the whole point of it is it heightens the scariness because it makes it seem more real than just a glossy movie. Like, oh, this was really shot. And so, but what Danny Boyle did was he didn't have the handheld, because there's weaknesses, I think, to the found footage, meaning it's usually from someone who's holding a camera the whole time and they're part of the story. But you're limited on what you can see, which is advantage but disadvantage. But what Boyle does is he gives you the sense and feel of the home video footage or the found footage movie without being found footage. So he's able to marshal all the directing elements that will help the story despite that. But yeah, I remember too, when I first saw it, it's like, wow, that looks really like video-y and stuff. But then
it's like multi-generation dubbed. It's not just video, it's like VHS video. It's been dubbed over to make it look, and the Blu-ray edition of this movie looks just as terrible as the DVD. I was quite shocked about that. They did not go for the source material on that camera and like retime it to make it look a little better. There's no reason to buy the Blu-ray of this movie because it's the video transfer and it looks terrible, and that's intentional because it's super gross.
Well, that's why I think it's so important to me, because men's issues and stuff today. I feel like in our culture, basically men are under attack. Maleness is under attack, literally. Like, just toxic masculinity basically means being male. I mean, it's not like oh, if there are some men who are jerks and asses. It's like, no, it's a part of who men are. And so there's all these different elements in our culture, which is basically, men are the ones most mocked on TV shows and stuff, make them look like fools and stuff. And look, I realize too that women have their day now, and they're leads in all the movies and in all the series and stuff, and that's fine. They're going to have their day, but it's all part of that current social milieu that I feel is sort of like denigrating to men. And the biggest accusation is that, you've heard the thing. It's men who fight wars. If women were in charge, we wouldn't have any wars. Well, that's BS. But not only that, it's like, yeah, men are the ones who start the wars, and men are the ones who finish the wars. And that's what I liked about this movie. It was admitting, yeah, men can be evil, and here's how bad they can really be. And it still turns my stomach when I see that moment, But then it also says, but there is hope, and there's a way out, and the way out is by masculinity, chivalrous masculinity. So I'm probably repeating myself, but that's what I loved about it. And so I was excited when 28 Weeks later came out, which stars Robert Carlyle. It's a little different take on it.
Hold on a quick second.
Go ahead.
I need to make some comments before we move on.
Please do.
And I'm going to take us off on a slight tangent that is about what you're talking about, but I want to talk about it now. First off, really quickly, my point of view, and again, I'm more liberal in some areas than you. At the end of the day, I think we're both pretty much on the same page. But, women having their time and their due, and people of color, I think it's way overdue. And I don't think this is a passing fad, and I hope it's not. I really do want to see women on equal standing and people who are not white on equal standing in TV and getting a chance. And we are but that said, and I really do want to see this, I'm angry like you are at this white toxic masculinity nonsense. And I want to mention a quick thing about the current reboot of the Twilight Zone, because it relates to exactly what you were just talking about. And I do want to go here for a second, because I've been burning up over this, and now I have a chance to talk about it. So there was an episode this season, the Jordan Peele reboot, which about 50% of the episodes I hated for exactly that. It was white male bashing, and I thought it was rubbish. But there were 50% of the episodes that were awesome. And the last episode of the season is about an African-American writer on the show, and it becomes meta. And it was beautiful. It was awesome. And I'm like, that's what I want to see. I don't want to see all this stuff that's male bashing and white male bashing. And the episode that was the most atrocious about that show, that was a disgrace, was about, it's an episode where it starts out with this guy who's playing Lenny Bruce on Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. He's a great actor. He's playing this guy, and this woman comes over to his place, who's the main protagonist, and they're having a date, and there's a meteor shower, and they go out and they're looking around. There's like all these little meteors coming. It's like, oh, cool. And they go out and they find them. Well, what comes of the story, to make a long story short, for no reason at all, the men in this town, who are like 98% white, start taking these meteorite rocks and going to the bars in their homes and throwing them in their drinks and start drinking them. And it becomes a trend that they're going to drink meteorite rocks. And they go nuts. They start beating on women, killing each other, trying to rape women. And it goes, the husband of one of the characters suddenly just starts trying to kill her. And you know where I'm going with this. I saw it coming in the first 10 minutes. Do you want to know what happened at the end, when the military comes in and cleans the town out, which is kind of like the end of Night of the Living Dead? I was just waiting on the edge of my seat. I'm like, I'm waiting for you to say it. I can't believe you're going to say it. And they did. The excuse was, boys will be boys. There's nothing in the rocks that made them psycho, murderous, killer, rapists. They just were looking for an excuse. And the lead two women that survived walk out of this medical tent that's mostly women doing the science, but it's a guy at the door with a machine gun. And he looks at the woman, the protagonist, and looks up and down and goes, "You should dress hotter. You should dress prettier." And she looks at him and goes, "No." And she leaves. And I almost fell off my chair. I'm like, I cannot believe Rod Serling, his daughter's involved in this show. I cannot believe that Rod Serling would have said that was okay. They're saying Rod Serling's daughter's involved. And I'm like, you're telling me that he would say that bashing white men like himself are just waiting to be murderous killers and rapists for no reason? Yeah. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I knew it as I was watching where they were going. And so anyway, I need to put that in about what you just said.
No, that's fair enough.
And you see how worked up I am. I was so pissed about that.
No, it's good. That's really good. And by the way, I can't say enough about the fact that even though I'm a right-wing conservative guy and all that. So, but the truth is I'm very, very aware and very much want to admit to the negative side of men and how bad they can really truly be. And that's why I love the movie, was because it honestly had both. And that's what I'm looking for in a movie. Because in fact, when I first watched it, and this brings up another thing about the whole nature of horror and zombies that we didn't quite address. And that was when I first watched it, I was actually, because most of Hollywood is leftist, and for me as a conservative, there's not as much that satisfies me, as others. But I'm watching something, and oh boy, I could see the context, the military men, and they're gonna rape the women, and in a way, the point was that they were no different than the zombies. In a very essential way, technically they were worse because they were human, and yet they were willing to rape and destroy, and for their own satisfaction. Well, all the zombies are doing is just trying to eat, and so there's a real equivalency going on there, But then, I was thinking, oh boy, is that what it's going to be? The message. But then when I saw how it ended, I thought, wow, that was so much more profound than a political agenda to it, But this is one of the elements of I'm jumping back a little bit. We're going to have to end here, but the nature of horror is that so you have to show the evil, you have to show the violence, to face death and all that kind of stuff, and the problem is that when the first half of the story is oftentimes very negative, right? And this is where my wife kind of has problems, where she sees the negative part in the beginning of the story. She's like, I don't like this. These are bad. I want to see goodness, not bad. And I'm like, well, honey, they got to show the bad so that when the good comes in and saves the day at the end, then that makes more sense, right? Because if there's no real evil to save, then it's not an interesting story, And I think that's the nature of horror as well, is that it ramps it up. It's whatever, the grossness, the violence, whatever. But in the end, most of the mainstream horror movies do have a message that is good. It's not about glorifying the evil. However, a lot of horror movies don't end positively, but that doesn't mean, now we're back to Night of the Living Dead, right? Where we were talking about this. And just because a movie ends negatively, it could be nihilistic, meaning, the filmmakers, and by the way, I think there are more of these today than ever before. It could mean that they're saying, their life has no meaning, and this is all going to end like this. It's a metaphor for our lives. We're going to die and be food for the worms, right? But not always. A lot of times it's a tragedy, and it's to get you to think, wow, look what could happen, the negative that could happen, and how tragic it feels when you're watching that story, right? It's like you're supposed to be inspired to say, therefore, I don't want to let that happen. So I want to be a man of courage. I want to be a man of self-sacrifice, so that it doesn't end up like that. That's how, when I see Night of the Living Dead, it's a tragedy, but it is the warning. It's a moral warning saying, look, we must think these things through. We must be cautious, or these mistakes will occur, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I'll let you kind of wrap this up. Chris, you wanted to talk a little bit about the military aspect of the 28 Days franchise, and then if you want to bleed into 28 Weeks Later, and then we're going to just wrap up the show.
Yeah, so just to bring this to a close, but some important things here. 28 Weeks Later deals with that rogue group of military guys who are not following orders, who are really evil and trying to take advantage of these women and take them for themselves. That's a totally acceptable view of like rogue military guys. But what gets me annoyed is so many films use this imagery of the military just goes nuts, and everyone in the military, 99% of the people who are involved from top to bottom are willing in a second to burn towns, kill people. We saw it in Outbreak. We talked about previously. The military is just, we're going to kill everybody, let's burn them. That is so ridiculous. There's no way the men and women of this country who are fighting for our freedoms and protecting us, that is not a mindset that comes up. That is not an option. And I know we like to. I actually met somebody on the street and I talked to some other people that I knew during this COVID pandemic, and they were literally quoting me about what they thought was happening now, and all kinds of conspiracies. And I was like, and when I watched Outbreak, I was like, wow, you're just quoting the film. But a lot of it comes up about the military, and 28 Weeks Later deals with this issue. It's military, and even though it's in London and it's in Britain, it happens to be that everybody who's coming in who's in the military speaks with North American accents. They happen to be Americans who are coming in, and they're willing. Idris Elba, who's British, is talking like he's from America, like he works for the whether it's the UN or whatever. It sounds like he's an American, whether it's Canadian or from the USA. But anyway, it's that sense of. It's very annoying in these films that it's like a go-to that happens a lot in Hollywood films and in stories. And these zombie films almost always play up on that. And what's really nice about 28 Weeks Later is you have Jeremy Renner's character who says, I am a man of the military. I do protect people, and I'm not going to follow orders because I know it's wrong. And that it's really beautiful, because I think this film really helped to put him on the get him charted as a movie star, because then we have Hurt Locker and other things, and he became a superstar. But this movie is a smaller film that started to make him that guy who's very empathetic and intelligent, who's not going to follow orders. And that was a good representation, I think, of realistically what people in the military would actually do. Right. And this movie, in that moment with his character in 28 Weeks Later, not burning everybody and killing everybody to clean out this second wave of 28 week later version of the terrible zombie apocalypse. We saw it when we were talking about previously in Contagion, not following the orders. Lawrence Fishburne's character realizes that there's a guy who's lower in society, John Hawkes, who has a son, and he's a janitor, and John Hawkes' character calls out Lawrence Fishburne, and in the end of the movie, Lawrence Fishburne breaks with protocol. That's a gross, terrible break of what he's told to do and what he knows to do. He gives his serum and takes it to the guy, to John Hawkes' kid, and gives it to him and says, "You can't have the bracelet. I got to keep it to keep up appearances, but here it is because I want you to be protected because you're right. I'm in a better position." And that's beautiful. And I think we also get an Outbreak. The whole thing, why I think we really like that movie, is the human element. It doesn't matter about all this stuff about outbreak and disease and whatnot. That's whether it's realistic or not. What's beautiful about it is people who are willing to put their lives and their careers on the line to save other people they love, and people that they don't even know, people who are civilians who can't protect themselves. And so that's one of the really great things I thought about 28 Weeks Later, to wrap up this discussion. And I think we already talked about Robert Carlyle being a super evil zombie. I mean, we've kind of brushed up on it, but he's a super evil zombie who is the epitome. He's already a bad guy and a coward, and he becomes more evil. Super gross, terrible, violent evil, because that's what he is. Well,
wait, before you get into that, let me say that the movie starts with him, with his wife, and the zombies attack, and this is the quintessential, launch of the whole story is he gets so cowardly that he runs and leaves his wife behind him, and we think she gets taken out by the zombies. And so he's living this story. And it turns out he's got a couple kids who are out of town. So later on in the movie, he gets reunited with the kids, and he has to address them while he's got this moral, this thing hanging over him that he knew that he was a coward and let his wife to die. And it haunts him, And of course, the whole point of the story becomes sacrifice versus survival. And he is the epitome of personal survival, even to the extent where he gives up his own wife, right? But then it turns out she has some kind of immunity that she can be a carrier, but she doesn't turn into a zombie. So he gets reunited with her, and then there's all that interrelationship where she knows that he betrayed her, but he wants to come back, and it's just very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, and what's interesting is his character becoming the true evil version of himself kills his own wife, who's the only person there who may have had a cure. He kills her, it ends any chance, and it progresses all the way down to the worst possible situation. He's trying to kill his own kids. At the very last, he's trying to kill his own kids. It's the most grotesque version. And I'd say when you compare that to the other really great element in the film, which is self-sacrifice, Jeremy Renner's character, that is going against orders, you have the two versions again of terrible male violence that's present in the first movie, an awesome male standing up and doing the right thing.
Yeah, because he was a father and a husband who gave up his own family for his own self. And like what you said is he gets it's like, by the way, the weakness of zombie movies is that there's no individual zombie who's the bad guy. And I'm a believer in the traditional storytelling of having a strong villain. You can have all these henchmen, but you got to have one strong villain that's fighting against the hero in some way. And that's the weakness of zombie movies. So you got to find a villain. Usually it's a villain who's a real human, who's a bad guy, who's trying, right? But in this case, they were able to make the husband who became the zombie, and he ends up in a way hunting them down all the way to the end of the movie. So it was a very clever take on the fact that normally zombies are mindlessly trying to kill, but in this case he happens to have been following them. And I didn't even think about that until you actually brought that point up. But he's descending.
Yeah, and what's really interesting too, what you said about when you don't have a specific villain in zombie films are more like a disaster film. A tidal wave is coming, but in those films too, generally, Towering Inferno, whatever, there are going to be bad people who are getting in the way of good people surviving. And that's what you have with zombie films are in a typical one, is you have to have human beings. But Last Train to Busan has a similar bad guy who's nowhere near as evil as Robert Carlyle. But when we talk about that film, they use it there too. He's not a major... Next time, and he's not a major cliffhanger, but it's 28 weeks later and 28 days later complement each other very well.
You guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. Be aware, all my stuff is at Godawa.com, and all of Chris's stuff is at CMOBMO.com.
Yes,
CMOBMO.com. And stay tuned for the next episode, which will be part 2. It'll be Return of the Zombie Apocalypse. We're going to look at the Omega Man, I Am Legend, that trio of movies based on the original book, I Am Legend, and how they cover the different eras and how they reflected a growth in a way of storytelling and such, as well as The Walking Dead and some other stuff. So stay tuned. We'll catch you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Thank you for listening to the God and Entertainment Podcast. We'll see you soon.